In April 1920, a new country appeared on the map of the world. The Far Eastern Republic stretched from Lake Baikal to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing an area roughly the size of India. It had its own constitution, modeled on the United States Constitution. It had its own currency, its own flag, its own army, and its own democratic elections. Japan recognized it. Soviet Russia recognized it. The United States sent diplomatic missions to it. And it was completely fake. The Far Eastern Republic was a buffer state created by Lenin's Bolsheviks to solve a problem they couldn't solve through military force: Japanese occupation of the Russian Far East. For 2.5 years, this nominally independent democracy existed as a diplomatic fiction that everyone understood but no one openly acknowledged. Then, in November 1922, having served its purpose, it dissolved itself and was absorbed into the Soviet Union. This is the story of the Far Eastern Republic, how it worked, why it was created, and whether it ever had a chance to survive as a genuine independent state.
To understand why the Far Eastern Republic was created, we need to understand the situation in the Russian Far East in 1919-1920. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they pulled Russia out of World War I through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. This decision alarmed the Allied powers, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, who feared that German forces freed from the Eastern Front would overwhelm the Western Front. Additionally, the Allies had sent massive amounts of war material to Russia through ports like Vladivostok and Arkhangelsk. They wanted to prevent these stockpiles from falling into German hands. The pretext for intervention came from the Czech Legion, roughly 50,000 Czechoslovakian soldiers who had fought for Russia and were attempting to evacuate via the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, where they planned to ship to France to continue fighting. When conflicts erupted between the Czech Legion and Bolshevik authorities in May 1918, the Allies used this as justification for military intervention. In August 1918, multiple Allied forces landed in Vladivostok. The Americans sent about 8,000, 10,000 troops. The British sent smaller contingents. The Japanese sent 70,000 troops. That disparity in numbers was revealing. While the Americans and British framed intervention as rescuing the Czechs and preventing German gains, Japan had different objectives. Japanese military planners saw the chaos in Russia as an opportunity to detach Siberia and the Russian Far East, creating either a Japanese-controlled buffer state or outright annexation. The region was resource-rich: timber, coal, gold, fish, and access to the Trans-Siberian Railway, and Japanese expansion into Russian territory would secure Japan's northern flank and provide economic benefits. By 1919-1920, the situation had evolved considerably. The Russian Civil War was winding down. Admiral Kolchak, the white Russian leader the Allies had supported in Siberia, was captured and executed by the Bolsheviks in February 1920. The Czech Legion had evacuated. The other Allied powers, recognizing that the Bolsheviks had won and that further intervention was pointless and expensive, began withdrawing their forces. The Americans departed in April 1920, but Japan remained. By early 1920, Japanese forces occupied Vladivostok, the surrounding maritime province, and maintained garrisons at strategic points along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Japanese companies had opened offices throughout the region, and over 50,000 Japanese civilian settlers had arrived. The Japanese military had effectively occupied a significant portion of the Russian Far East and showed no signs of leaving. This created an acute problem for the Bolsheviks. Their Red Army had won the Civil War in the West and Central Russia, but they couldn't simply march east and evict the Japanese through military force. Japan was a major industrial power with a modern army and navy. A direct military confrontation risked a war the Soviets couldn't afford and probably couldn't win. Moreover, the Bolshevik government was desperate for international recognition and diplomatic normalization. Attacking Japanese forces would confirm Western propaganda that the Bolsheviks were dangerous aggressors who threatened international stability. The situation worsened dramatically in March 1920 with the Nikolaevsk incident. In Nikolaevsk on Amur, a Russian partisan leader named Yakov Trapitsin and his forces, a mix of Bolshevik partisans, Chinese, and Korean guerrillas, attacked the Japanese garrison after tensions escalated. The Japanese garrison was overwhelmed. What followed was a massacre. Trapitsin's forces killed roughly 700 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Thousands of Russian civilians were also killed in the subsequent violence and destruction of the town. The Nikolaevsk incident gave Japan a pretext and a propaganda victory. The Japanese government used it to justify continued occupation of the Russian Far East, claiming they needed to protect Japanese nationals and restore order. They occupied northern Sakhalin Island and launched retaliatory operations against partisan forces, killing thousands of Russians in response. Lenin understood that military force wouldn't solve this problem. He needed a different approach, one that gave Japan a face-saving way to withdraw while allowing the Soviets to eventually regain control of the Far East. The solution was to create a state that wasn't Soviet Russia.
The architect of this solution was Alexander Krasnoshikov, a Bolshevik with unique qualifications for the task. Krasnoshikov was born in 1880 in Chernobyl, the son of a Jewish shop assistant. He joined revolutionary movements as a teenager, was arrested multiple times, and in 1903 fled to the United States to avoid exile. In America, he worked as a house painter, then became a headmaster, joined socialist labor movements, and eventually attended law school at the University of Chicago, graduating in 1912. He defended striking workers and gained experience dealing with American legal systems and democratic institutions. After the February Revolution in 1917, Krasnoshikov returned to Russia via Japan. He became active in Bolshevik politics in the Far East, helping organize Soviet control in Vladivostok and surrounding regions. His experience in America made him valuable. He understood how to present Bolshevik policies in language that Americans and other Westerners would find more palatable. In January 1920, with Kolchak's collapse imminent and Allied withdrawal approaching, Krasnoshikov crossed to Red Army headquarters at Tomsk with a proposal: create a nominally independent democratic republic in the Far East that could serve as a buffer between Soviet Russia and Japanese-occupied territories. This buffer state would give Japan a government they could negotiate with that wasn't directly the Bolsheviks, allow the Soviets to avoid direct military confrontation with Japan, provide a democratic regime that the United States and other Western powers might recognize and support, pressuring Japan to withdraw, and eventually be absorbed back into Soviet Russia once Japanese forces departed. Lenin endorsed the plan. It was exactly the kind of tactical flexibility that defined early Bolshevik foreign policy, sacrificing ideological purity for practical advantage, with the understanding that the sacrifice was temporary. On April 6, 1920, a constituent assembly convened at Verkhneyudinsk, modern Ulan-Ude, and proclaimed the establishment of the Far Eastern Republic. Krasnoshikov became the first chairman of the government and Minister of Foreign Affairs. The new republic claimed territory from Lake Baikal to the Pacific Ocean, including Transbaikal, Amur Oblast, Maritime Province, and northern Sakhalin, roughly the modern Russian Far East. Initially, the Far Eastern Republic controlled only territory around Verkhneyudinsk that the Red Army had already secured after Japanese withdrawal from Transbaikal. The city of Chita, controlled by White Russian Ottoman Grigory Simonov and backed by Japanese support, remained outside its control. Vladivostok and the Maritime Province were under Japanese occupation. Much of the claimed territory existed only on paper.
Japan officially recognized the Far Eastern Republic on May 11, 1920. Soviet Russia recognized it on May 16, 1920. The timing was carefully calibrated. Japanese recognition came first, establishing that the FER wasn't simply a Soviet puppet. Then, Soviet recognition formalized the relationship. The recognition by Japan was particularly significant. By negotiating with the Far Eastern Republic rather than Soviet Russia, Japan could claim it was dealing with a legitimate, independent state rather than the Bolshevik regime it despised. This diplomatic fiction allowed negotiations to proceed that direct Soviet-Japanese talks couldn't. The Far Eastern Republic presented itself as a democratic, multi-party state with a market economy, everything Soviet Russia officially wasn't. Krasnoshokov personally drafted the constitution in English before it was translated into Russian. This wasn't accidental. He wanted to emphasize the republic's Western democratic character. The Constitution, adopted on April 27, 1921, closely resembled the United States Constitution. It established universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage with no restrictions based on nationality, sex, or religion. Separation of powers between legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Protection of private property, including foreign investment. Guarantees of civil liberties and individual rights. A parliamentary system with a constituent assembly elected by the people. Elections were held on January 9, 1921 for the Constituent Assembly. Multiple political parties participated, not just Bolsheviks, but socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and other groups. In Soviet Russia, such multi-party competition had been eliminated by 1921. In the Far Eastern Republic, it was official policy. The Republic issued its own currency, the Far Eastern Republic ruble. It designed its own flag, red like the Soviet flag, but with a blue square in the corner. The coat of arms featured not the hammer and sickle of Soviet Russia, but a pick and anchor, symbolizing mining and maritime industries. The army wore 5 pointed stars, but half red and half blue, distinct from the purely red stars of the Red Army. Foreign investment was actively encouraged. The Republic offered concessions to foreign companies for resource extraction, particularly timber and mining. This was anathema to Bolshevik ideology, which opposed foreign capitalist exploitation, but it served the political purpose of making the Far Eastern Republic attractive to Western powers and Japan. In practice, how independent was any of this? The answer is not very. Soviet control operated through several mechanisms. First, the Far Eastern Republic's army, officially called the People's Revolutionary Army, was essentially the Red Army under a different name. Its officers were Red Army commanders, its units were Red Army formations, its equipment came from Soviet supplies, its orders came from Moscow, filtered through the FER government structure. When the FER was dissolved in 1922, the People's Revolutionary Army was simply renamed the Fifth Army of the Red Army by decree, acknowledging what it had been all along. Second, while the Constitution promised multi-party democracy, Bolsheviks dominated the actual power structures. Lenin's instruction to Grozno-Shokov was that democracy is permissible, but slightly privileging the communists. In practice, this meant that while other parties could exist and even hold seats in the Constituent Assembly, critical decisions were made by Bolshevik officials who reported to Moscow. The democratic structures were real enough to be convincing internationally, but controlled enough to ensure the FER followed Soviet policy. Third, financial and economic ties bound the FER to Soviet Russia. The Republic depended on Soviet support for currency stability, trade, and basic governance. Without Moscow's backing, the FER couldn't function. Fourth, Moscow maintained direct oversight through party channels. The Russian Communist Party's Far Eastern Bureau supervised Bolshevik activities in the FER. Krasnoshokov himself was a member of this bureau. Party discipline ensured that even nominally independent FER officials followed Moscow's directives.
Yet, within these constraints, the Far Eastern Republic did function as a distinct political entity with genuine administrative capacity. Local governments operated with considerable autonomy on day-to-day matters. Trade and commerce functioned under different rules than in Soviet Russia. Multiple political parties genuinely existed, even if their influence was limited. Foreign diplomats dealt with FER officials who had real authority to negotiate, even if major decisions required Moscow's approval. A contemporary journalist described it as half and half democratic republic, half Soviet satellite. That captures the reality better than claiming it was either fully independent or merely a puppet state.
The Far Eastern Republic's primary purpose was diplomatic, to facilitate Japanese withdrawal without requiring direct Soviet-Japanese negotiations. Through 1920 and 1921, the FER engaged in extensive negotiations with Japan. The key issues were Japanese military withdrawal from Primorsky Krai, maritime province, including Vladivostok, compensation for the Nikolaevsk incident, economic concessions Japan wanted in exchange for withdrawal, and the status of Northern Sakhalin. Through 1920 and 1921, the FER engaged in extensive negotiations with Japan. The key issues were Japanese military withdrawal from Primorsky Krai, including Vladivostok, compensation for the Nikolaevsk incident, and economic concessions Japan wanted in exchange for withdrawal. The Far Eastern Republic's primary purpose was diplomatic, to facilitate Japanese withdrawal without requiring direct Soviet-Japanese negotiations. In July 1920, Krasnoshokov negotiated the Gungoda Agreement with Japanese General Takayanagi. This established a neutral zone between Verkhneyudinsk and Chita, allowing Japanese forces to withdraw from Trans-Baikal without losing face. They weren't retreating before the Red Army, they were recognizing the Far Eastern Republic's authority. Japanese forces completed withdrawal from Trans-Baikal in October 1920, and the FER capital moved to Chita. But Vladivostok and the maritime province remained under Japanese occupation. And here, the situation was more complex. In Vladivostok, a provisional government friendly to the FER had taken power in early 1920. But on May 26, 1921, a White Russian coup overthrew this government with Japanese backing. The insurgents established the Provisional Government of Priamur under the Merkelov brothers, Vladivostok businessmen who opposed both the Bolsheviks and the FER. Japanese troops protected this regime, creating a cordon sanitaire that prevented FER forces from approaching Vladivostok. Ataman Grigory Semenov, one of the last significant White Russian leaders, arrived in Vladivostok after the coup, hoping to rally white forces. But even his Japanese backers had tired of his instability and brutality. They refused to support him, and he eventually fled to Manchuria and then exiled. The Priamur government lasted just over a year. Its leaders had little support beyond Japanese protection. In July 1922, a Zemsky Sobor assembly deposed the Merkelov brothers and named General Mikhail Diederichs as military dictator, a former Czech Legion officer who represented the last gasp of organized white resistance in the Far East. The situation changed dramatically on June 24, 1922, when Japan announced it would withdraw all forces from Siberia by the end of October 1922. Several factors drove this decision. First, international pressure. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921-1922, which addressed naval armament limitations and Pacific affairs, created diplomatic pressure on Japan to end its intervention. The United States in particular opposed Japanese territorial expansion in Northeast Asia. Second, domestic political changes in Japan. The Hara cabinet, which had supported aggressive intervention, fell in 1921. Subsequent Japanese governments faced public opposition to the expensive Siberian occupation that had produced little tangible benefit while costing money and lives. Fourth, the Far Eastern Republic provided Japan a diplomatic exit. By negotiating with the FER rather than the Soviets directly, Japan could frame withdrawal as an agreement between equal states rather than submission to Bolshevik pressure. With the Japanese announcing withdrawal, panic spread through White Russian communities. Thousands fled Vladivostok throughout summer 1922, many to Manchuria or further abroad, rather than face Bolshevik rule. On October 25, 1922, FER forces, which were Red Army units under another name, occupied Vladivostok. General Diederik's and remaining White Russian forces evacuated by sea. The Russian Civil War, which had begun in 1918, was officially over. 3 weeks later, on November 15, 1922, the Far Eastern Republic dissolved itself. Its Constituent Assembly voted to merge with the RSFSR. The government transferred all authority and territory to Moscow. The People's Revolutionary Army was renamed the Fifth Army of the Red Army. The diplomatic fiction had served its purpose and could be abandoned. Japan retained Northern Sakhalin until 1925, ostensibly as compensation for the Nikolaevsk incident. In reality, Japan used Northern Sakhalin as a bargaining chip in broader negotiations about diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union and resolution of various territorial and economic disputes. A treaty in 1925 finally resolved these issues. Japan withdrew from Sakhalin, and full Soviet control of the Far East was restored.
This raises a counterfactual question. Could the Far Eastern Republic have survived as a genuine independent state? The answer depends on what we mean by survival. If we mean continued existence with nominal independence but effective Soviet control, that was certainly possible. The Soviets had experience with satellite states that maintained formal independence. Mongolia existed as a nominally independent Soviet satellite from 1921 to 1924 before becoming the Mongolian People's Republic. The FER could have continued in similar fashion indefinitely if Moscow found it useful. But if we mean genuine independence with self-determined policies distinct from Soviet interests, that was effectively impossible given the circumstances of 1920 to 1922. Several factors precluded real independence. Economic dependence. The Far Eastern Republic had limited industrial capacity, depended on trade with Soviet Russia for critical goods, and lacked sufficient internal revenue to maintain independent state functions without Soviet financial support. The FER's economy had been devastated by years of civil war, Japanese occupation, and White Russian military requisitioning. Recovery required outside support, and only Soviet Russia was willing to provide it without demanding territorial concessions. Military dependence. The People's Revolutionary Army was the Red Army under a different flag. The FER had no independent military force that could defend against external threats, particularly from Japan or China, without Soviet backing. Creating such a force would have required years of development and resources the FER didn't possess. Geographic vulnerability. The FER's territory was a thin strip along the Trans-Siberian Railway, surrounded by larger powers. China bordered the south. Japan was across the Sea of Japan and held northern Sakhalin. Soviet Russia bordered the west. Any of these powers could have dominated the FER without Soviet protection. Political reality. The Bolsheviks created the FER as a temporary expedient. They never intended permanent independence. Moscow controlled the party structures that supervised FER governance. As soon as the international situation allowed, which it did once Japan withdrew, Moscow dissolved the FER. But let's consider an alternate scenario where circumstances were different. What if Japan had remained in Vladivostok longer? What if the United States had actively supported FER independence as a counterweight to both Japan and Soviet Russia? What if Krasny-Shokov and other FER leaders had sought genuine independence rather than serving as Moscow's agents? Even in this alternate scenario, long-term FER survival faces serious obstacles. The Manchurian problem. The FER's south border with Manchuria was porous and unstable. Warlord conflicts in China frequently spilled into border regions. Without strong military capacity, the FER couldn't secure its frontiers. The resource curse.
The FER's wealth in natural resources, timber, minerals, fish, agricultural land, made it attractive for conquest or domination by larger powers. Small resource-rich states in strategic locations rarely maintain independence when surrounded by great powers unless protected by international agreements or external security guarantees. Internal fragmentation. The FER's territory encompassed diverse populations: Russians, Ukrainians, Chinese, indigenous peoples including Buryats, Yakuts, Evanks, and others. Forging national identity from this diversity while maintaining democratic governance would be extremely difficult. The FER had neither time nor resources to develop strong unifying national institutions. The ideological problem. The FER's democratic constitution was designed to appeal to Western powers and Japan, but most of its Bolshevik leadership didn't actually believe in multi-party democracy. Krasnoshokov himself was a committed communist. If the FER had genuinely moved toward independent democratic governance, Moscow would likely have intervened, either through party channels or direct military action to prevent loss of control. The most plausible scenario for FER survival would have required 1. Continued Japanese presence, creating mutual Soviet-Japanese interest in maintaining a buffer state. 2. Active American support and recognition, providing international legitimacy and potentially economic assistance. 3. Development of genuine multi-party democracy and market economy, creating distinct political identity. 4. Discovery or development of sufficient economic resources to achieve fiscal independence. And 5. At least a decade of stable existence to build functioning state institutions and national identity. None of these conditions existed in 1920 to 1922, and most were directly contrary to the interests of the powers involved. The FER was created to solve a specific diplomatic problem, not to establish a new nation. Once that problem was solved, the state had no further purpose.
The Far Eastern Republic's brief existence reveals several patterns about how states function, and how they're sometimes created for purposes that have nothing to do with serving their own populations. First, the FER demonstrates that state sovereignty is often a diplomatic fiction, maintained because it serves powerful actors' interests. Every government knew the FER was controlled by Moscow. Yet Japan, the United States, and others treated it as independent because that fiction facilitated negotiations that direct Soviet-Japanese talks couldn't. This wasn't unique to the FER. Client states, puppet regimes, and nominally independent entities that lack genuine sovereignty appear throughout modern history. But the FER is an unusually transparent example where the pretense was openly discussed in diplomatic communications, even while being officially maintained. Second, the case shows how institutional structures can be created rapidly when circumstances demand, but take much longer to become meaningful. The FER established democratic institutions, legal frameworks, and state apparatus within months. But these were shells without substance. They looked like functioning democratic institutions while actually serving as transmission mechanisms for Moscow's control. Creating the appearance of democracy is easy. Creating actual democratic governance with dispersed power, competing interests, rule of law, and meaningful participation takes generations. Third, the FER case illustrates tactical flexibility in early Soviet foreign policy. The Bolsheviks compromised ideologically, tolerating multi-party democracy, private property, and foreign investment in the FER because tactical advantage required it. But these compromises were always understood as temporary. Once circumstances changed, ideological purity was restored. This pattern, tactical retreat followed by eventual advance, characterized Soviet policy in multiple contexts throughout the early Soviet period. Fourth, the case reveals how great power competition shapes small states' existence.
The FER existed because Japan and Soviet Russia both found a buffer state useful. Once Japan withdrew, the buffer was no longer needed, so the state disappeared. The FER's population, about 1.5 million people, had minimal agency in these decisions. Their state was created without consulting them, maintained for external purposes, and dissolved when those purposes were satisfied. This isn't unusual. Many border states and buffer territories throughout history have existed or disappeared based on great power arrangements rather than local populations' preferences. Finally, the FER case demonstrates the relationship between international recognition and state survival. International law claims that states exist when they have defined territory, permanent population, government, and capacity to enter relations with other states. The FER met all these criteria, but it existed for only 31 months because the power that created it chose to dissolve it. Legal definitions of statehood matter less than political circumstances when great powers are involved. Finally, there's the question of whether the FER's democratic institutions had any lasting influence. After the FER dissolved, the Far East became subject to standard Soviet governance, single-party rule, state-controlled economy, collectivization of agriculture. But individuals who had participated in FER governance carried that experience forward. Some, like Krasnachikov himself, fell victim to Stalin's purges in the 1930s. Krasnachikov was executed in 1937 after being accused of various ideological deviations. Others adapted to Soviet reality and survived. The democratic structures they'd helped create were forgotten, erased from historical memory, or reinterpreted as temporary expedients rather than genuine alternatives.